Good morning. I wanted to talk to you about PFAS, the forever chemicals that you're probably starting to learn a lot more about and how they're affecting our waterways in the Chesapeake Bay. So let's start with what are these PFAs, PFOAs, PFOS, the perfluoroalkyl substances. They're a group of chemicals that are known as forever chemicals because they have essentially unbreakable bonds. They were developed actually by accident and found to have a lot of industrial food packaging uses because they provide sort of a sealant. So as you can see here, there are many, many sources of exposure to these types of chemicals. Firefighting foam, shampoo, a lot of consumer products, food packaging, pesticides, paints. They're pretty much everywhere. And as much as they're unbreakable in their bonds they form, they really dissolve well in water. And that's where we end up having a lot of concern about our potential exposure to these chemicals. They also bioaccumulate in proteins, so things like fish species, animals that we might eat or consume, they are going to have extra large concentrations of these chemicals. So knowing that these things are everywhere, why is that a problem? They have a multitude of health problems associated with them. They haven't really been studied as much as we would have liked, because when they first came about, there was a back and forth that I'll get to in a moment with the Food and Drug Administration that then resulted in not doing significant testing at the time. But there was some initial testing, and more recently has been a lot more showing that these chemicals are associated with different types of cancers, developmental issues, birth defects, thyroid disease, which I personally have, hormone suppression, impaired liver, kidney, pretty much you name it. There can be exacerbation of any health issue you might already have from exposure to these chemicals. So this is a bit of a timeline for you of the history of these PFAs or PFAS chemicals. They were first discovered back in the 1930s, and then they started being commercially used in the 1940s. They were used for things like Scotchgard, again, any kind of keeping out of moisture or any sort of sealant is a really common place that you find them. There were a lot of uses for them, in large part from firefighting foam on military facilities, but also probably lots of other things that we're not sure of. In the 1960s and 1970s, we started to see documentation of these chemicals in fish. And then in 1998, the EPA learned of the toxicity of these chemicals. Did we stop using them? No, we did not. In fact, the uses became a lot more broad and prevalent at that point in time. And when the Food and Drug Administration looked at studying the health impacts and looking at those concerns, the manufacturers of these chemicals and these products with the chemicals at the time just said, FDA, instead of regulating, how about we just use less? And as illogical as that might seem, that's actually what they did at the time. So we could have had health guidelines, safety limits back as early as the 80s or 90s on these chemicals, and unfortunately we didn't. Up until quite recently, through 2016, the EPA was using a health advisory limit on 70 parts per trillion. This was just recently updated by the EPA to 0.02 parts per trillion. And I want you to keep that number in mind when we go through this presentation, because you're going to see a lot of limits and a lot of samples that show much, much greater concentrations of these chemicals in our watersheds locally here in the Chesapeake Bay. So there is some action being taken. This isn't all just a sad story here. Maryland and the Maryland Department of the Environment have started doing some testing and monitoring for these chemicals. There's also a mapping effort underway to look for where they might have greater concentrations or where we might have greater areas of concern. So we do have some sampling that was done back in 2020, and then another phase last year. And they showed us pretty high concentrations in the vast majority of samples taken. We did see that there were some of these PFA substances that were found in virtually all of the tests. A few of them were below what they called detectable limits at the time. Here's one of the more disturbing concentration levels. Dr. Vicki Blazer from the US Geological Survey did a study which was released back in 2020. Some of the data is from 2018 and 2019, but it showed one of these PFA or PFOS substances in fish tissue. So fish tissue shows this bioaccumulation that you get with chemicals like this, because fish are eating other species, other littler species that might have levels of PFAs, PFOAs in them, and that accumulates as little tiny fish eats slightly smaller fish, and that keeps going up. So she found levels up to 574,000 parts per trillion. Again, EPA limit 0.02 parts per trillion. That was one of the highest samples. That was in the Potomac Watershed. And these were in smallmouth bass. But the average level that they found in the blood, the plasma of smallmouth bass, was 381,000 parts per trillion. That is a really concerning level of these sorts of chemicals that are being found in this fish tissue. So in 2021, I just mentioned that MDE put out a report looking at our public water system. So these are drinking water supplies, public water supplies in the state, and found that 75% of the systems where samples were tested showed measurable levels of PFAs, PFOS chemicals. And that looked at 68 drinking water systems in the state of Maryland, measured about 70% of what is currently serving as public drinking water systems in this state. In addition to looking at our drinking water systems, there's also been study of pesticides. Pesticides are routinely sprayed on our crops, in the air, and often get directly applied to water. In fact, today I got to hear about mosquito spraying being undertaken in Maryland right upstream of a drinking water system. Well, in this study of pesticides, there were very, very high concentrations observed. Vectobac, Maverick Perimeter, these are all at thousands of times the EPA safety limit. And when EPA got these results, they said that there was concern that perhaps contamination had come from the containers, and investigated that, and indeed found that some of the containers were at least a partial source, but perhaps not the entire source of where these substances were coming from. So a study out of Texas, which was peer reviewed, showed that 6 out of 10 pesticides had astonishingly high levels of PFAs. You can see here the different types of active ingredients used throughout these pesticides that are showing up consistently and are the primary methods for applying pesticides. Malathion is one of the most commonly used pesticides worldwide and is showing 17.8 million parts per trillion. And again, these are being sprayed on golf courses, lawns, schools, and then they run off into our local waterways, which form our drinking water supply. But you're also getting additional potential exposures as these get into our food system and can bioaccumulate in human populations the way they are currently doing in our fish. So this is just sort of a diagram of how that works so that it's a little easier to understand. And Dr. Kyla Bennett from Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility is quoted in a recent report saying, if the intent was to spread PFAS contamination across the globe, there would be few more effective methods than lacing pesticides with PFAS. Just let that kind of echo in your head for a second of how we have these toxic chemicals with demonstrated public health impacts, and we're spraying them everywhere. So they are getting into our food system, into our water, into animals that are consumed. And again, we're taking in much more of these chemicals than I think anyone ever thought that we may have been. And I believe that there are going to be long-term health consequences for populations due to these exposures. Another method of getting PFAS chemicals onto the land and in our waterways is sludge and land application. So in a wastewater treatment plant, what happens is that solids are separated from liquids, and these solids then go through an anaerobic digestion process, and then can be applied to farm fields, to golf courses and other places where they are looking to use them as fertilizer. Well, because of all of these consumer uses and the pesticide uses, we are seeing potentially very high applications of PFAS chemicals directly to the land that's growing our food, and again, then allowed to run off into our local waterways. So we're getting this right there on our plates. Most recently, the Waterkeeper Alliance, which we are a part of in Waterkeepers Chesapeake, did a national PFAS sampling report. This was just released on October 18th, the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. And a total of 113 waterkeepers surveyed 114 waterways across 34 states and the District of Columbia. 83% of the waters tested showed PFAS contaminations and chemicals in them. But here locally in the Chesapeake region, 16 samples were taken. These are upstream, downstream samples. So technically it's 32 samples, but 16 coupled samples. And all of the ones in Maryland detected PFAS. In fact, one of them in Piscataway Creek in Prince George's County showed a level of over 1,300 parts per trillion. And this is Piscataway Creek, named for the Piscataway tribe, whose lands I'm currently occupying, as are other residents of DC and the DC metro area, occupying Piscataway lands. And this is what's happened to them because of the prevalent use of these chemicals, from everything from pesticides to food packaging. So here's what we need to do now. We need to stop this cycle. We need to stop applying these chemicals. It's good that the EPA is looking at strengthening these health-based standards and setting maximum contaminant limits for PFAS, but that's not enough, because if we continue to use them and apply them, we're still just building up more contaminants in our local systems and in our bodies. So we've gone beyond just concern of, are these getting into our drinking water? Because at this point, they're getting everywhere. When you get these pesticides and PFAS chemicals into our soil that we're using to grow our crops, you're killing all of the little critters in there that are essential for soil health and breaking things down. They're getting in the wastewater treatment plants, creating this sludge that's contaminated with PFAS that we then spread on the land, and it gets back through the system again into our waterways, into our drinking water, into our food system. And then we have bioaccumulation in the creatures that are consuming more and more of this through the food cycle and the food chain. So what's next? We need to figure out what's going on with these chemicals and more properly regulate them, find alternatives. But at this point, there's so much being spread around in our watersheds. We're also going to have to think about how we actually start treating wastes and water to reduce our exposures. Fortunately, we've had some progress on this in the Maryland General Assembly with the George Walter Taylor Act back in earlier this year, where some of the longest standing uses for these chemicals were prohibited. But we still need to do a lot more if we're going to be safe. So we're going to be looking to the next General Assembly session and thinking about how we can zero in on these chemicals, where we're getting exposed, where contamination lies, and how we can demand some accountability and ensure that we're no longer having to have these exposures throughout our entire ecosystem. And that's all I've got for you today. We're going to hand it over to my colleague, Brent Walls, the Upper Potomac Riverkeeper. Thank you.